How extensive was the Arab slave trade? Did they ever come up with any estimates on how many Africans were enslaved and trafficked by the Arabs?
Yeah, one estimate is that something like 9 million people died during the 19th century. The Arab slave trade was going a lot longer than the European slave trade was. There were estimates that perhaps 100,000 people a year were dying.
You're listening to Quorum Radio.
Did Arabs themselves go to the African continent into regions where black people were to capture as well?
They were capturing and trading them. We sometimes forget a major language in East Africa is Kiswahili, which is commonly known as Coast Arabic. And the reason that people in Tanzania and Uganda speak a version of Arabic is because it was colonized by the Arabs. Zanzibar was an Arab kingdom. Zanzibar was it's part of a country. It used to be Tanganyika and Zanzibar is an island. Now it's called part of one large country called Tanzania. But the Arabs used to buy slaves. They used to enslave people. It was almost as bad as the transatlantic slave trade, the slave trade in East Africa for the Arab markets.
Right. So then, is it accurate to say that the Arab Muslims were involved in enslaving involving African populations in East Africa, and the Europeans and black tribes were involved in slaving on the West Coast?
Yes, absolutely accurate. Yeah, and some people think that as many people died during the Arab slave trade in East Africa as died during the transatlantic slave trade. But I mean, no one kept accurate figures, but it was a terrible traffic.
Right. And so did the Arab slave traders carry off slaves and sell them to Europeans, or did they sell them in the Arab world?
No, they sold them to Arab countries. They were captured all over Central and East Africa and then taken to Zanzibar, which is an island off the coast of Africa. And from there, they were traded onward up into the Arab world, the Ottoman Empire.
How extensive was the Arab slave trade? Did they ever come up with any estimates on how many Africans were enslaved and trafficked by the Arabs?
Yeah, one estimate is that something like 9 million people died during the 19th century. The Arab slave trade was going a lot longer than the European slave trade was. There were estimates that perhaps 100,000 people a year were dying, in addition to those who were taken to the Ottoman Empire. But of course, these people didn't keep records. What's certain is that whole areas were depopulated.
Right. So that 9 million refers to basically Africans who were carried off by Muslim traders?
No, African. There was a very high mortality rate. It was tied up with the ivory trade because ivory was very much desired. Before there were plastics, ivory from elephants was useful, but elephant tusks are very heavy. And the Arabs realized they could kill two birds with one stone. They could capture slaves, get the ivory, and get the slaves to carry the ivory to the coast. Because, as I say, the tusks are heavy, but there was a very high mortality rate amongst those slaves. So you might start out with 100 slaves in Central Africa, and by the time you got to Zanzibar, half of them might have died.
Wow. So basically, when that figure of 9 million refers to Africans who were involved in gathering ivory, carrying it to the coast, and being slaves.
Right? In the process, yeah.
Let's look at the slavery on the west coast of Africa. Who was involved?
On the west coast of Africa, it was Europeans involved. It was, to begin with, the Portuguese were the first there. Then it was British, and then it was Americans. And they started landing in places, what modern day Nigeria and Ghana. And they found in Nigeria today, you've got three ethnic groupings. You have the Yoruba, the Igbo, and the Hausa in the north, who are Muslim. The Igbo were very extensive slave traders before the arrival of the Europeans. And so when the Europeans came and the Igbo saw all the wonderful things that they had, all the things, the mirrors, the guns, manufactured goods, it was an natural thing for them to start trading slaves with the Europeans.
How many? You mentioned 9 million. I think basically corresponding to the Arab-dominated slave trade in East Africa. What type of statistics do they have? Estimates about the number of Africans who were enslaved by the European American slave trade?
Between 10 or 12 million.
And out of those 10 or 12 million, how many were captured initially, hunted, let's say, and captured by Africans who captured other Africans for slavery?
Oh, 100%. The Europeans didn't have the ability to hunt and capture other Africans. There were kingdoms along the coast. It would have led to major wars. You couldn't have done it without military intervention. All those were slaves that were captured by other Africans and taken to compounds and sold to the Europeans. The Europeans didn't land and then hunt slaves. They simply landed and bought them.
Right. So then isn't it ironic that they now want to blame slavery on whites and demand reparation when they weren't the ones that captured them in the first place? That's kind of funny.
It's exceedingly ironic, yeah. The whole thing is a swindle. It's a trial, as we say in Britain. You know, it's like a confidence trick, and they might get away with it. I know there are increasing calls for reparations, but the whole thing is a racket, you know.
Sure. Well, and I wonder what it would do to the economy of Great Britain, because you have how big is your black population in the UK now?
It's about 4% of people in Britain are black.
Right. So then, are they demanding reparations as well? Many of them were not even descended from slaves.
No, that's absolutely correct. A lot of them have come straight from Africa rather than. There are two main types of black people in Britain. There's the Caribbeans, who are people who are descendants of those taken to the Caribbean as slaves. And then there are many people from Africa and Nigerians and so on that have come to this country directly from Africa. They weren't slaves. But yes, I mean, if anybody senses that there's free money about, there'll always be a rush for it.
Right. So, we have a situation now in the United States that's unusual. In fact, I spoke to a woman from South Africa, a white woman, who said to me she's deeply concerned and she's convinced that what happened in South Africa to whites is going to happen now to whites in the United States. Do you think that's an extreme statement?
I think it would take a while before there's enough black people in America to make it so, isn't it? There's still a majority of white people in the United States at the moment, surely.
Well, sure, absolutely, yeah. There's the blacks might be 14% of the population, and the rest are largely white, although, of course, some of them are Hispanic, white Hispanics, and also Hispanics of African descent, or partial or mixed descent. So, right. So, where do you see, based on your understanding of history, you've seen how the movement towards, let's say, redressing past evils is going. What do you think is going to turn out? What do you think is going to happen in when you look across the Atlantic? What do you see? What are the clouds upon the horizon? What's the prognosis? What's the future of America from the standpoint of a historian?
I hope America continues to be the world power, because it's not domestic worries about black people doing this or white people doing that. The big menace, of course, is China. So it's a question of whether or not America has the political will to maintain its role as the world's policeman. If it doesn't, then obviously China will expand, and it's already expanding its influence into Africa. And America is now facing a crisis in the South China Sea, whether or not they're going to stand up to China and prevent it from bullying countries like the Philippines or Formosa or Taiwan.
No, they've been trying to. I happen to think that, given the fact that China is a superpower, I mean, you can say what you want about the United States as a sole superpower. I never bought that. Why? Because the Russians have nuclear weapons, the Chinese have them, and so I just don't buy it. And if they wanted to field an army, and they have an army, but they could quickly increase it to 25 million, probably overnight. And so it's a power to be reckoned with. I've always thought that the best thing to do is encourage, and I hope Trump did this, encourage the Australians to get nuclear weapons, the Japanese, the South Koreans, and then once they have them, of course you can encourage them to have missile technology, so that they can kind of wage an asymmetrical propaganda war against the Chinese. The Chinese think that they are, it's their right to boss everyone around. They're the world's bully, and they want to throw on their weight. And I think the British peoples, the English-speaking peoples, should join together in some way to effectively counter them. And I don't know what your views are on COVID-19 as a weapon, or just an unfortunate virus that affected the world. What's your view on it and China's role in its propagation?
I think perhaps the Chinese are responsible, but I don't know whether it was a deliberate act of biological terrorism. It's certainly very handy to have the West tied up in a crisis like this, because Chinese now got pretty much of a free hand to do things. We're preoccupied now with COVID-19. It's the only thing that people are concerned about. So the Chinese can get up to all sorts of mischief. So it was very handy, even if it wasn't released deliberately. It certainly worked to their advantage.
Yeah, sure. It's been something that I think you could say has destroyed trillions of dollars in the West. And the Chinese seem to be in great shape now, and they're partying, having a blast at bars. They're open again, and and America is fighting between themselves about should we open up or shouldn't we? So anyway, well, listen, Simon, great to have you on Quorum Radio. What's your next book? I assume you're writing another one, right?
I'm writing 3 books at the moment.
Only 3?
Yes, I know, I'm slacking a bit. The next book coming out is one about American soldiers who were executed in Britain during the Second World War. It's called Fighting for America, Executed in England, and that would be published.
Were there very many?
Yeah, there were 18.
What happened? Can I ask briefly about that? That's shocking.
Yeah, cool. When the American army came over, they made it the Roosevelt insisted that they wouldn't be subjected to British law at all, that they could only answer to American military law. But the British were happy with that, but they insisted that the Americans couldn't execute their own men, that the British would, if there were any hanging to be done, the British would do it, because the British were much better at it. So, no, it's true. The Americans used the cowboy coil noose and a fixed drop. A lot of Americans that were executed had their heads torn off or they choked to death, whereas the British had it down to a fine art. So the British hangman executed the men. So yeah, it's just about that. It's an account of every one of those 18 men that was executed during the Second World War, every one of the Americans.
Were these cases of men who got into fights at bars and stabbed another fellow soldier or British?
Yeah, some were, but also people were executed for things that weren't capital crimes in Britain. Some of those men were executed for rape, which hadn't been a capital offence in Britain since the 1830s, but it was under American law. You probably know that in America, people were still being executed for rape up until the 1960s. And for armed robbery as well. People were executed for robbery during the 60s.
Sure, and I think kidnapping as well.
Yeah,
wow. So
that's right. Law. Yeah,
shocking. And what are the other 2 books that Simon Webb is working on?
One is going to be about slavery in Africa. What we've been discussing now about how the Africans were complicit in slavery. The other one is about anthropology, about the possibility that European DNA is different from DNA of Africa, which is why Europe European culture, European civilization has conquered the world rather than African culture and civilization.
Yeah, shocking. That's it's kind of, they consider it racist to point something out that the first skyscrapers weren't in Africa; they were in other places, and the steam engine wasn't invented there, was it, Simon?
Wasn't. That's quite true.
The airplane wasn't invented in Nairobi.
Nothing has been invented in Africa since the stone hand axe, 30 or 40,000 years ago.
Wow. Yeah, it's funny how telling the truth really bothers people.
Well, yes, it's true.
It's so yeah. Well, listen, Simon, it's been great having you on Quorum Radio. Hope to be able to do it again when your books come out. You're a fascinating author with great titles. So thanks a million for being on Quorum.